Hello? Okay, let's get the next talk. I'd like to introduce Professor Maithilee Kunda. She did her Bachelor's of Science in Math with CS from MIT, and then she did a PhD in Computer Science from Georgia Tech. She is currently an assistant prof at Vanderbilt School of Engineering and Computer Science since 2016. She's the director of Vanderbilt's Laboratory for Artificial Intelligence and Visual and Logical Systems. She's a founding director of the Vanderbilt First Center for Autism and Innovation. And that's an organization that helped bring Temple Grandin to Vanderbilt to give a talk in 2018 in the Chancellor's lecture series. So I don't know if you know who Temple Grandin is, but she's quite a famous person who's has autism spectrum disorder. I think is that, yeah. And she wrote a book called Thinking in Pictures, which inspired Maithilee to go on her current path of visual thinking. In 2016, Maithilee was recognized as a visionary on the MIT Technology Review's annual list of 35 innovators under 35. It's pretty humbling. I'm not even sure if I'm on the top million under 1 million years of age. In 2020, it gets better. In 2020, she was featured on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper. So you can watch these videos online where she interacts with Anderson Cooper and showing him some of her work. In 2022, her video game that her lab developed to help autism spectrum disorder teens with social skills, develop their social skills, was featured by the New York Times. So there's been a lot of press around Maithilee's work. She's also an active promoter of women and minorities in STEM, as well as primates, because one of her students also wrote an app that orangutans have been using in the zoo. So you can see videos of that as well. So help me welcome Maithilee Kunda.
So much for that lovely introduction, Jeff. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So yes, I'm really delighted to be here, part of your Brain Day celebration today. And I will actually be showing you some exciting videos from the Anderson Cooper event during my talk. If you watch the actual 60 Minutes clip, like the pithy quote they got from me was me nodding and saying, oh yeah, that is interesting. And I was like, I actually talk about science also. Anyways, I'll just jump right in. So also, as Jeff mentioned, I'll tell you a brief version of my origin story for embarking on this research. So this is the cover of the book, Thinking in Pictures by Temple Grandin. So Temple Grandin, she's a really cool person, professor of animal science at Colorado State University, and she is on the autism spectrum. Have any of you heard of her or seen, there was like a cool movie that they did of her life? I think it was with Claire Danes. It was really good. The book is also excellent. So Temple Grandin talks in her book and in lots of her other writings and talks about how she is a very visual thinker. So she does, in her sort of perception of how she thinks, she does a lot of things visually that other people might do verbally. And she works as a designer of equipment for the livestock industry. This is from her website, one of the livestock facilities that she designed. And on her website, it also has this amazing statistic that says over half the cattle in the US go through equipment that she either designed or worked on, which is just amazing. And she's testified as an expert before Congress on humane treatment of animals, because that's also like something that her facilities are designed to encourage. And so, just amazing success in this area. And a lot of it she credits to this type of visual thinking she does. In her book, she also talks about how this strong tendency towards visual thinking has caused her difficulties in other areas. So she talks about understanding abstract concepts, or when she's communicating with people, she sometimes has trouble. So it's a really fascinating read. So I read this early in grad school. It's formative intellectual time. And I sort of settled on these questions. And honestly, this is really what has driven my research ever since. So what is Temple Grandin actually doing when she talks about thinking in pictures? More precisely, how might this work in information processing terms? What does thinking in pictures actually mean? How can we get computers to do the same thing? And in recent years, I've started to look more at questions of learning. So why is Temple Grandin so good at this type of thinking? And we know, there's a lot of research in cognitive science and education now that spatial skills are learned and can improve with practice. And so this has a lot of implications for how we think about infant learning and also STEM in particular. So there's a lot of growing research now that looks at how visual and spatial skills are linked to STEM learning and STEM career outcomes. And it seems to be a really important point that we need to look at more in education. So in my work, I am a computer scientist, well, among other things, I guess. And oh, let me see if I can I don't actually see that on mine. It might be on. Oh, it's on my, maybe it's on my other. Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. This, yes, thanks. Okay, great. Okay, in my research, my students and I, a lot of the work that we do is about revolves around building computational agents that attempt to reason about various kinds of problems with visual imagery. And so this is like a sort of simplified schematic about how a lot of our agents are, like the architecture behind a lot of our agents. So, get inputs from the world. And kind of the key thing here is that in the working memory of our agents, so the information as they're sort of like pushing it around and reasoning, it's actually stored as visual images. And so one analogy I often give is that if you are familiar with sort of traditional theories of reasoning from AI, for example, like logic-based reasoning, we have like logical, like agents that reason using logic. The agents we build are very similar to this, except instead of the internal symbols just being, variable, like arbitrary letters or something, the internal symbols that the agent uses are actually pictures. And the reasoning operations, instead of being like logical operations that combine symbols in various ways, the reasoning operations are quantitative transformations over images. And so the question becomes, how might an agent string together these sort of image manipulations to work through complex problems of various types? So in this talk, I'm going to cover a few different projects that we've done. So how does this kind of reasoning work? The reasoning agents we build sort of have a visuospatial domain knowledge that defines essentially like the types of reasoning operations that they can use. Where might that knowledge come from in a learning sense? Where do high-level reasoning strategies come from? And finally, some translational work about how this can inform cognitive assessment and education. All right, so how might reasoning with visual imagery work? For the first, a few projects, I'm going to talk about a test called the Raven's Progressive Matrices Intelligence Test. Have any of you seen this before? It's a pretty widely used test of intelligence. It has problems that look more or less like this. This is actually my own hand-drawn example that's similar to Raven's-like problems. So you have a matrix of figures with one thing missing, and then you just have to pick from multiple choice options what goes in the empty spot. So what do you all think? What is the correct answer? 2. Yes. All right. So that is an example of a problem that's sort of on the easier side in the sort of Raven's family of tests. Here's one that's a little bit harder. Any guesses? So there's a guess. I heard a guess for 5, some guesses for 4. Any other guesses? Depends on how much coffee you all had this morning. The correct answer on here is 4. Yeah, it's a bit different looking. So this is what Raven's problems look like. Oh, this problem is sort of on the harder end of what you would get on the standard version of the Raven's test. But there's actually one that goes even harder than that. So, oh, right. So I started looking at this test. Actually, there's these in science, there's sort of these weird confluences that happen sometimes. And this was one of them. So I read Thinking in Pictures. Actually, I think it was in 2007. And that same year, this paper came out that was led by this really cool person, Michelle Dawson. She's also on the autism spectrum. And she was basically looking at ravens' performance in kids and adults on the spectrum compared to neurotypical kids and adults. And there's actually, I'll tell like a 30-second story here, because this is one of my favorite stories of sort of inclusion in science. So the way I heard this story is that Michelle, not a scientist herself, but she was really well-read and would read kind of all the research papers coming out about autism. Laurent Moitron is a scientist, and he had been working on autistic cognition and perception for a long time in Montreal. And she apparently approached him and said, Laurent, I've been reading your papers. I think your interpretations are wrong. And then he, I think to his credit, I think a lot of people in that situation might have said, like, oh, like, no, we know what we're doing. Or even, that's interesting. Yeah, we'll work on that. But instead, he said to Michelle, that's interesting. Why don't you come work on that with us? And so she did. And so she's actually done quite a lot of work with their research group. And I think sometime just a few years ago, she got like an honorary doctorate because she had made all of these great research contributions. So anyways, I like that story a lot. So this paper was a big paper when it came out. And it basically, they were looking at behavioral data, just sort of scores from children and adults on the spectrum. And what they found was that at least in the samples they had, both children and adults did a lot better on the Ravens test than would be predicted by standard IQ test scores. And the reason this was very surprising is because in most sort of neurotypical samples, these two things will be very tightly correlated. And that's part of why the Ravens is used so widely, because it's sort of like an easy, fast way to get an estimate of IQ. And so anyway, so this was kind of a puzzle, like why in the autism groups in the study, why were the Raven scores so much higher than from these other tests? So I read this paper and I had my thinking in pictures lens or hat on, I guess, from reading Temple Grandin's book. And I thought, well, the Ravens test is a visually presented test. If you have somebody who's thinking in pictures, maybe that is like that's more amenable to visual thinking strategies than the sort of wide range of test types that you get in like a full IQ test. So this is kind of a simplification, but if we think about ways of representing and processing information, suppose I gave you these shapes and I said, are these the same or are they different? Lots of different ways to solve this problem. I think one of the things, one of the themes that when you're looking at representation in sort of reasoning, one of the themes that emerges is an assumption that if we want to directly compare things, we need to represent them in the same format somehow, and you have some like operations that you can use. So one way, sort of I would say a traditional AI reasoning approach, if I was building like a logic-based agent or something to do this, is let's use perception on these inputs and extract symbols that describe them. And then I can have some comparison operator over the symbols. So this is like a very reasonable approach. But I could also take a different approach and say, well, why not just compare in pixel space itself? Like, why not just do this directly on the visual representations? These are both perfectly good strategies. They're different. And essentially what we were doing with our Ravens work was asking a question of, instead of sort of doing things in using amodal propositional symbols, what happens if we try to reason our way through the test using these symbols that are actually little images in the working memory of the agent? So we were not the first people to try to build computational models of Ravens type problems. And in fact, this type of work goes back to some of like the earliest AI research that was ever done. Way back in the 60s, a guy named Thomas Evans at MIT built a program to solve, it wasn't actually Ravens, but it was different from a different standardized test that's not used anymore, but geometric analogy problems. So Evans built a system to solve these types of problems. And he said, and again, this is like a very sort of, I don't know, it's the way computer scientists often think. He said, I'm going to assume that perception can operate over these black and white images and extract a bunch of symbols. And at the time, he was like, that's like a little too hard for me to do right now. So he just did it manually. He was like, I'm not going to solve the perception problem. This is an example of what one of the problems looks like translated into his particular propositional representational format. So you can see, you know, there's a bunch of symbols, and then there's also symbols describing spatial relationships. And so this was, you know, essentially assuming, you know, you have perception will produce something like this, and then the reasoning can happen in, you know, over these types of symbols. This is it was really cool work, and it was very successful. This program that he wrote, it could solve all of the problems that he had in this particular set of on this particular test. As a tiny bit of computer science history trivia for you, anybody recognize what language this is that he used? Yes, Lisp. So it also says in Evan's paper that at the time he wrote this program, it was the largest program that had been written in Lisp to date. No, this is not the program, right? This is just the one problem. But the program, and it's when you read his paper, the reasoning system is broken into these two really nice stages of reasoning, which kind of makes sense. But when you read sort of further, it was because he couldn't fit the whole program in memory at once. And so I picture him, you know, loading in the punch cards, like he had to do like stage 1 of reasoning and then stage 2. Pretty cool. So, there was, you know, since the 60s, there was actually lots of other people working on computational models of Raven's problem solving, including Chris. I think you had some work that I remember several years ago. And a lot of these models would sort of take a similar approach in terms of dividing up, you know, we'll assume perception gives us the symbols, and then a lot of really interesting work on the reasoning was happening with these amodal propositional symbols. We took this different approach, again, inspired by Temple Grandin and kind of inspired by Michelle Dawson's paper. So we asked this question of, you know, what happens if you build a reasoning agent for ravens that uses visual imagery as the representational substrate for solving these problems? I started this during my PhD dissertation ages ago. Recently graduated student Ryan Yang continued it for his dissertation and really sort of did some really interesting work expanding all the reasoning capabilities. So in the system as it exists today, I guess, so I mentioned that the system will take, you know, these sort of just the raw pixel-based inputs from the test, the raw pixel-based images, and then it has in its, you know, the part of its long-term memory essentially is a set of manually defined reasoning operations that are image functions. So the model can rotate images in various ways, or it can combine them using these types of operations. So, you know, take two pixel-based images and lay them on top of each other and sort of intersect them and get the resulting set of pixels out. And then the model also has, again, sort of built into it, knowledge about spatial relationships in a problem matrix. Essentially, the idea that, you know, collinear lines of entries would share some kind of property, and then parallel lines are where you're building your analogies. And there's like, you know, various ways you can sort of group these in a problem. And then another thing that Ryan did, and I'm not going to sort of go into the gory details of this, but basically, if you look at a Raven's problem like this, one thing that's really interesting about Raven's problems is that there's a lot of redundancy in a single problem. And what I mean by that is, you know, you can look at the top row and sort of decide, you know, try to figure out what's going on. And then you can look at the second row to confirm or reject that hypothesis. And there's a lot of redundancy that you can exploit in various ways. And so Ryan, one really interesting addition to the system that Ryan made was he had 3 different models that would exploit this redundancy to different extents. So one of the models would essentially be really confident and just look at one row or column and be like, yes, I know what's going on. I'm going to predict the answer. And then there was a prudent model that would kind of like look at every row and every column and really try to double check everything. And then there was like an in-between one. So these were all sort of different configurations of the model that we could try. So before I show you how the model does, I will orient you to sort of what results on the Ravens test look like. So the standard version of the test has 60 problems, and your score is just number correct out of 60. These green lines are showing some norms for children in the US. So, you know, if you kind of look at the middle 50th percentile line, you can see that like, you know, I guess average, let's see, around like a 9-year-old will get like half of the problems right on average. And 16-year-olds are getting up into around like 50. So it's like a reasonably difficult test. It's not trivial. So I mentioned we had all these different configurations of the models that either had, different access to these ways to build analogies or different operations or those different reasoning strategies. And here is sort of the coverage of performance that we got. So the worst performing model only gets 3 correct out of 60, but the best performing model got 57 correct out of 60, which was actually surprising to us because in a lot of the previous, so the Ravens has been studied, not just in AI, but in, psychology. There's been neuroimaging studies, and a lot of the older research at the time we were starting out on this work, a lot of the research suggested that you might use some kind of visual strategy on the easy problems, but once you get to the hard problems, like for example, there was some early neuroimaging work that showed that once you get to the hard problems, people's language and sort of working memory brain regions would show more activation. And so there was this sort of idea that we have this shift in strategy towards what people would sometimes call like an analytical or even a verbal strategy for solving the hard problems. What this work showed is that you don't necessarily need that. Like even if you're just using the pixels, you can actually get up to a score of 57 out of 60. So this is not, this is not a model. This model is not very human-like. So this is not intended to be like a high fidelity model of human cognition or reasoning in autism or anything like that. What this model serves as is a proof by existence that just having these pixel-based representations and the set of reasoning these quantitative image operations can get you up to that level of performance. So I think human mental imagery probably works in some, some similarities, but very differently in some ways. But this is meant as a sort of existence proof that type of reasoning can get you pretty far. So I mentioned, actually, I'll show you. There's another sort of result. So this is showing a different view of those results, where you can see. So the Ravens is also divided into 5 sets of 12 problems each. That's just what these different colors are. And this is basically showing different configurations of the model as a function of. So going across, like each sort of box is a different set of analogies that the model can use to solve a problem, like either just rows or just columns or various combinations like that. These horizontal bars are different sets of types of transformation operations that the model has access to. And you can kind of see, it's really like with all the bells and whistles that we get up to this, 57 out of 60. And if you sort of take away certain capabilities, the model doesn't do as well in various ways. So there was another interesting confluence that happened actually from another paper coming out of the same group. I collaborate with her now, Isabelle, I can never say her last name beautifully enough, Soulière. She also has been working with Laurent Mautron and others in this group. So this paper was from her and Michelle and others. They basically looked from a neuroimaging perspective at, what do patterns of brain activity look like between autistic adults and neurotypical adults while solving Ravens problems. And they actually found something that sort of was suggesting the same idea, that it looked like the autistic group in their study were showing more visually oriented problem solving strategies with essentially no between group difference in accuracy. And so I think this is a really great example of, in cognitive science, we always talk about how it's interdisciplinary and, we want converging evidence from different methodologies and different fields. And so I think if you sort of look at the story, I told you, we had Michelle's paper that was showing these behavioral results that were like puzzling. And then my group, we went off in this computational direction to say, well, like what's actually feasible from a computational perspective if we assume this type of visual problem solving. And then Isabelle's work was looking at the neuroimaging. And I think it was a nice example of how sort of convergent research was pointing to, that there might be something to study. Of course, there's a lot more to study. I don't think we understand fully what is going on yet, but so anyway, so that was one example of the type of computational models that we build. We've done a whole bunch of other ones. I think intelligence tests are really interesting for a lot of reasons. And so we've looked at several of them, and I've had lots of great students working on many of them. Yes, question.
Yeah, this is a clarification.
Yes. Yes.
The first focus on next areas. You've been talking about these computations, whereas actually would more abstract and higher level visual features. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yes, I can. So, yes, I think it is an open question in human visual mental imagery, like at what level that happens and like what kinds of representations are actually being manipulated in what ways. So I think, again, like I think our computational modeling work was not trying to do things in a necessarily like neurally high fidelity way. So we just chose pixels as like, it was sufficient. So we didn't go to any like higher level features. But I think it's yeah. So it's a good question. Like, I think you could do something similar with features that might be more aligned to like higher level things in human visual processing, but we have nothing. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So I talked about, that's kind of an example of how reasoning with visual imagery might work. And next I will talk about actually 3 different pieces of research that looked at the learning question in different ways. Okay, so this is more work from my student Ryan, or my recently graduated student. So in the system that I just showed you, that is coming from a tradition of AI that is called knowledge-based AI, or sometimes cognitive systems, where we sort of hand engineered the domain knowledge and the reasoning operations, and then the system uses search to sort of, at runtime, essentially, to search how you can string together these operations to find an answer to the problem. There's been a lot of emphasis in recent years in AI on machine learning based approaches to reasoning. And so, and there's been work on the ravens, also. And it's a little bit different in flavor. And so these systems essentially will say, here is our architecture where we're not going to put in the reasoning operations or the sort of procedures manually, but the deep. So there's a lot of this is like deep neural networks. So the deep network would essentially be trained on a large number of ravens-like problems, and you try to see, can the model sort of learn these relations and sort of ways to combine information in a way that can solve problems from like a test set. And so traditional, like a lot of the models that came out sort of had this approach, kind of a very traditional sort of deep learning approach, where you have this idea of like trying to learn features, and then the features are, sort of combined in the hierarchical way to try to get to the answer. Ryan had this idea because he was really thinking deeply about, like what is happening when an intelligent agent is looking at one of these problems, and there's perceptual stuff happening, but there's also like conceptual comparisons between, like what's over here in the problem versus like what's over here. And so he designed a different type of architecture that essentially just sort of like sliced it's really interesting. It was actually sort of almost like funnily simple in its implementation. So you basically have like a 4D array of the stack of problem images, and then you have like the convolutions operating over them. And if you slice it sort of the traditional way, you're learning features sort of within each image entry and sort of, and combining them. But if you just slice your 4D array the other way, then you start to learn features that are actually going across image entries. And it turns out that if you sort of string these together, and the architecture actually ended up having like lots of these layers where you're learning these perceptual and conceptual representations and then sort of unifying them and then like separating it. So it had lots of these layers. And it turns out that this actually did really well. And so this is very recent results that we have. I think the paper is just on arXiv. This might actually be more recent than the arXiv paper, but long story short, this approach did very well on some of these large ravens-like data sets. This is one called the Raven data set. And then there was another one called PGM. That's a bit harder. And we also were doing pretty well on this. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but if you're curious, please talk to me about it later. I will tell another little science story that happened in the later parts of this work. So Ryan was working on this. Anyways, it's funny now. It's funny to me. I don't know if it was funny to him at the time. But so Ryan was working on this. And early on, the model was doing really well on some problems. But there was this one set of problems from this, standard, it was like a standard data set. Everybody was using it. There's this one subset of problems where the accuracy was just really low. And Ryan couldn't figure it. And everybody has trouble with this. So like all the papers that were published on this data set, this Raven data set, they all showed, they would have accuracy pretty good on these and this one subset of problems. It was just sort of like take. And it was like, well, is it just hard to learn those relations with deep nets? It's like all these, questions about like what's going on here. So Ryan started trying, he got really bothered, I think, by this. And he started trying stuff. And he was like, well, maybe if I try to like encode the position, and again, this is just a lot of details, but try to encode stuff explicitly, maybe that didn't help. And he's like, well, what if I do this other type of kind? That didn't help either. And so he did this and he did this and he tried, basically, this was like 6 months. And remember, every single time he's trying one of this, then he has to do all these computational experiments to like train these models. It was all very, he kept going, kept going, kept going, kept going. He tried a lot of different things and nothing was working to make the performance on these problems better. Finally, he went and looked at the data set that everyone is using. And this table is showing the number of training items per problem subtype in this data set. And guess what? The ones colored in red over here were the ones that the model was having a lot of trouble with. And the ones colored in green over here were the ones where the model was having good performance. What do you notice about this? Anybody? So how do you interpret this? Yes.
Aren't many samples or training samples for the harder problem?
Yes, there was just like an imbalanced training data set. And it was like a quirk of how the problems were generated. Because the authors who published the data set, they had also published their, this is how we generated the problems code. And it was just a quirk. And then he basically created a new data set that was balanced across problem types. And then magically, this difficult thing that everybody had been wrestling with, and it's like, oh, why can't, like, what is the deep reason our models cannot do this type of problem? It was actually a very simple reason. But I also think that's a great story. And in fact, I am just as proud of Ryan for doing this as for all of the other great modeling work he did, because I think, this is also what science needs. Sometimes you just, the mystery is not as deep as you think, but it was really his hard work and persistence that illuminated this problem. Okay. So that's kind of like one view of learning, but now I'm gonna go to like a slightly different view. So this was work by a really great undergrad I had named Patrick. So we were looking at Raven's problems. It's like this one is familiar to you all now, and what I showed you, the first model I showed you, would solve this problem in what I would call a very deliberative way. So like let's take the left image and like rotate it and see if we can get it to match the right image, and then look at the second row and, kind of this very step-by-step thing. If we look at this, it's tempting to me to imagine another way of solving this problem, which is like, can't we just, as people, when we look at that top thing, can't we just kind of look at that and like the missing part just appears, emerges into view? What would we call that in psychology or cognitive science? Yes, exactly. Yes. Like, could there be some kind of gestalt image completion thing happening? So Patrick and I were talking about this, and Patrick had the idea, this was like a few years ago, and it was just when some of these image in-painting models were coming out in computer vision. So in-painting is a very classic problem in computer vision going back decades, which is essentially the problem of if you have an image with some stuff missing from it, can we get models to fill in the missing pieces? Like many problems in computer vision, in-painting saw a lot of really impressive successes with the advent of deep learning networks in the last few years. This particular model that we ended up using used a variational autoencoder, if you're familiar with those types of models, to essentially so this was what the training data looked like, where the model would be given an image with some stuff blotted out, and then it was trained to predict what should be there, over some particular data set. So it was Patrick's idea to say, what if we use this kind of in-painting model as a model of this gestalt image completion for solving Raven's problems? And so he sort of figured out a way, again, I'm not going to sort of go into this in a lot of detail, but basically these autoencoders have like an encoder part of the network and a decoder. So the encoder takes pixel-based images and puts them into some kind of latent variable space. And so that's, that gets trained over all of this data. And so we basically we took a trained model and then we feed in a Ravens problem and it encodes all of the images. It generates a prediction for what goes in that empty space. And then we can pass that through the decoder and get like a pixel-based image out at the end. So a note about this work, these models are really powerful. I am pretty sure if we took one of these models and trained them on Ravens-like images, like black and white shapes, I'm pretty sure it would do swimmingly. I think it would be fine. But we actually ended up asking kind of a different question, because with the Ravens test, really with all kinds of cognitive assessments, you're not really supposed to sit down and practice taking them, right? It's really supposed to be, you run around living your life, and then you sit down at a table and somebody gives you this test, and it's like, how well can you apply all of the things that you have learned to this particular test of reasoning? And so what we were curious about is if you take these in-painting model, if you take this in-painting model that had been trained only on real-world photographs, how well could it do on Ravens problems? And we actually had 4 different models that were trained on different types of images, different types of photographs. So one was basically trained on pictures of objects. This is from ImageNet. One was faces, one was textures, and one was scenes. Here is what the results ended up looking like. So these are the 4 models I just mentioned. These colored bars, essentially, I mentioned the Ravens tests have like different sets of problems. So each set has 12 problems. And so this is basically how well each model did on each set. And we actually used, anyways, 2 different Ravens tests, but there's like sort of extra set in there. But so a couple of observations. You can see that the objects model actually does the best overall. This did not surprise us because, so if you think about what's actually in these photographs, the objects, the pictures of objects, like ImageNet objects, tend to be sort of centered, like there tends to be a single object that's like roughly centered in the image frame. And so, you can kind of think about, learning things like symmetry in both horizontal and vertical directions from seeing, like pictures of things. And those kinds of spatial concepts are present a lot in the Ravens test. Whereas, for example, the faces model does the worst. I mean, the model trained on faces does the worst overall. And I think that's because, so for example, like with faces, you would only ever learn horizontal symmetry. You would never learn anything about vertical symmetry just from only looking at faces. The textures model does the best on set A of the Ravens. And set A actually is very pattern completion-y types of problems. And so this also kind of like makes sense. I think the biggest surprise we had from this set of results was this green bar right here. So set E of the Ravens is the most difficult set. It is supposed to, kind of like I was mentioning earlier, like people have always sort of assumed that set E really requires like analytical strategies. And even in the earlier model I showed you, even the model that's using visual imagery, it was still like taking a lot of steps to get to the answer. It was like composing all these operations together and everything. But here we're actually showing with this model that you just have a model that's all it's done is looked at objects and learned to complete them. It just can look at these really complex reasoning problems in set E, hallucinate an answer, just like one step, and actually solve half of the problems. And I think if we I actually should go talk to some people who use Ravens in their sort of practice. But I think people who use Ravens for assessment would be surprised by this result, saying that like it's possible to actually get half of set E right with this sort of like this sort of very perceptual type of reasoning. Yeah, question.
Yeah, so I think you might have partly answered it. I was wondering what it meant for the model to get it right. So you basically show it the matrices with the blank one blank, it fills it in, and then you do like a pixel-wise comparison to that.
Oh yeah, great question. I didn't actually say, so yes, thanks for asking. Yeah, so what we actually ended up doing is, so it gets the prediction. I think then, what we actually ended up doing is comparing the answer choice to the options in the latent space. So we passed all of the answer choices through the encoder also. And then the similarity was done in the latent feature space. And then, so we sort of decoded the prediction just to be able to look at it. Yeah. And in fact, that is the next slide I have. So this was, so again, the results. Here's some of what the actual predictions looked like. So this is coming from the model that was trained on objects. And so you can kind of see, so like that problem that I showed you, it's actually like pretty good, given, so remember, this model had never even seen black and white line drawings before, essentially. But, it actually filled in that information pretty well. I was impressed with this one on the top right, because it kind of gets the up and the arrows going down and plus the little dotty things across the side. Some of them, don't look all that good. It's a little bit gobbledygook-ish. This one I actually was also kind of impressed by because it's not correct, but it's like on the right track. That's like, I would call that like a good attempt. Questions about this? Yes.
Were all of these correct?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. That's also something, because we were doing the comparisons in this latent space, like I should actually look at that. I don't know for these. Yeah. And we didn't actually end up looking at that. Patrick graduated and left us. There was a lot that we didn't look at, but that would have been cool to look at, is like how does the correct and incorrect map onto like what we would call correct and incorrect? I don't know. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Does the degree of similarity between what emerges
Uh-huh.
in the model and what the correct answer is depends on the level of the test? So when you show it a simple one like the
Uh-huh.
Top right one, not top right, but the second,
Yeah.
yeah, that one, and the answer is very similar to that. But then the bottom right one, maybe the answer is similarity because it's a harder one, or maybe this one underneath. The similarity between what models predict and what the correct answer is.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, so like to some extent you can see in these results that yes, like the easier sets our models did better on, kind of. But yeah, and it also gets into a lot of like, like for example, whether the model would be correct or incorrect also depends a lot on the particular set of answer choices. And that's been sort of designed and refined in the official test over the years, to sort of, follow certain like normative patterns and things like that. But that's also something we didn't look at in detail in this work. Are there questions about this? Yes.
Just out of curiosity, whether it's CMP.
Ah, yes, that's funny. I was actually pausing because that's exactly the question I was waiting for. Yes. So you may have noticed that sets C and D don't look very good on any of these. And again, this is a little bit speculation, but set C on the Ravens test has a lot of problems that involve progression. So for example, none of these are real problems, by the way. We don't share real problems to protect the test security. But this is a very C-like problem. And if you think about problems that involve progression, they're not actually very symmetric. And so again, it's a little bit of speculation, but I would think that the model, for example, like trained on ImageNet, would want to make this like symmetric and might not, although this one is maybe countering my hypothesis a little bit. But that's again, that's what I think was happening in set C a little bit. Set D has a lot of problems that involve permutations. Like these two are very set D-like problems. And you could sort of build a similar story there of a thing, something with permutations is not going to have this like holistic symmetry that I think was probably sort of more primary in what was learned by that model. Yeah, but great question though, great question. Other questions? Okay. So that was one look at learning, and I really liked this project that Patrick did, and I think this idea of having a model that sort of like runs around looking at photographs, and then we can see what kinds of implicit spatial information is learned and how does that express itself on a test. Like I would love to extend this work to look at cultural differences in how people perceive the world. So we haven't gotten past this work right here, but I'm really excited about that. About looking at like what are the kinds of inputs that humans actually get, And so the last sort of learning project I'll talk about was actually looking more at this question of, what kinds of data do people learn from? What I'm going to show you is not looking at cultural differences, but actually developmental differences. So we learn a lot of this stuff as babies. And this next project has been in collaboration with Linda Smith, who's a really cool developmental psychologist at Indiana University. Linda was one of the people who pioneered putting head cameras on babies to actually start to see, like, what are the visual inputs that babies actually get? And how can we look at those inputs to better understand infant learning? So here's a little snippet from one of these baby head cams. This is, typical. Yeah. Very spatially rich learning experience, right? There's a lot that could be learned. So we started talking to Linda about this and looking at these kinds of videos. Turns out this data is really, really messy, really hard to work with, requires a lot of annotations, there's a lot of like irregularities. So we ended up making our own sort of infant-inspired data set called Toybox. And basically what Toybox has is videos of a bunch of different objects from common household categories undergoing manual, like handheld manipulations, which we know this particular type of interaction is super important in infant learning. And we have both structured transformations and some unstructured transformations. And so this was basically all my grad students, wearing pivot head camera glasses and spinning objects in our lab for a long time, many hours on end. And Colin, I think I'm excited to talk to you because you were like, oh, if only we had some dynamic videos that we could let our models learn from. Well, yes, we should talk later. So we built this data set to basically support various kinds of experiments looking at, how these kinds of spatial transformations and regularities can drive learning in various ways. This work has been led most recently by my current PhD student, Deepayan Sanyal. And basically one of the sort of high level themes that we look at with our Toybox data set is basically that, if you look at, so a lot of computer vision has been driven by data sets like ImageNet that are what we call instance rich, but viewpoint limited. Meaning, if you're looking at ducks in ImageNet, you'll have, 5,000 different ducks, one picture of each duck, right? So there's only one viewpoint per duck that you get. But when you think about infants playing with toys or with the family dog at home or their sippy cup or, whatever it is, a lot of the learning data that infants get is viewpoint rich, but instance limited. So there's been some really, really interesting studies. Linda has looked at this in her head camera work, but even earlier, there's been these sort of diary studies of what a baby would see. And it's like, kid sees like 12 different ducks by the time they're 2 or so, I don't know. It's, it might not be so many ducks, but you see an awful lot of those specific duck instances. So the question we've been asking is, we have a lot of current research in computer vision on models that learn from this type of data. What kinds of models might learn well from that type of data? And, how do they look different? And it's actually, as a sort of high-level observation from this work, I always like to remind my students, it's interesting when we started working with Toybox data, it's like if you take your typical, vanilla deep learning network and sort of try to train them on these types of more infant-like data, they usually don't do all that well. Like the performance will sort of not be as good as ImageNet. But I like to remind people that most of the current machine learning models we have, all of these architectures and everything have been optimized. And I mean that at a high level. This is like people over years and, so many different thousands of labs across the world working on this to try to make better models have been optimized essentially for internet style data. So I don't take it as a given that our current deep nets or transformers or anything are actually the best learning models for human learning inputs. And it might be, who knows, but I don't think we know that yet. Anyways, so also I was really excited about Khalid's talk because we also have been doing stuff with SimClear, self-supervised learning again. And so basically this is an illustration of this particular architecture where you essentially take So basically this a little bit review now from this morning, but try to learn visual features by taking, so in this case, you have two different images. You apply image augmentations to each one, and then you try to learn features so that the augmentations of the same image are closer together in feature space than augmentations from different images. And in the original SimClear, basically, this is a place where human expert knowledge is defining the self-supervised signal that the model has. So we basically say, we know that you can take a giraffe, a picture of a giraffe, and crop it and change the color and rotate it, and it's still a giraffe. So that's, we are putting that into the model, and that's actually that's the learning signal. So we asked this question, if, since we have in Toybox, you actually have access to multiple views of the same physical object, what if we use those transformations to drive self-supervised learning instead of just the synthetic augmentation? So essentially, instead of artificially rotating something, what if we take, different views of the same object from a given video and kind of in, like the way we, I think this is a really interesting when you think about infant learning, because a baby, when it's learning, can be holding, say it's holding a toy duck or whatever, might not know that this is a duck early on, but it knows that this object that it's physically holding is the same across this 5-second span because it's physically holding the object, right? Object permanence. And so that's essentially the big idea behind this particular hypothesis. So we did this. And so we basically just used, the same SimClear architecture, sort of everything was standard. And like I said, you start with an anchor image. Then we had different versions that we tried. Self is basically the same as the original SimClear, where you take just one image and then we just synthetically augment it in various ways. Transform was we take the original image plus one that's from the same video, but like this, manual transform, like I said. Object was a little bit subtle, but it was basically the same object, but from a different transformation video. So it might be more like a stronger rotation, essentially, or like a bigger rotation, I guess. And then class was just another setting where we took object, like two different ducks. So essentially we're using supervised information, but in the self-supervised framework, just to see like what would happen. Oh, yeah. Yes. Great question. We just left them in, so we don't know. We have like bounding boxes, as you can see, so like the hands. But I actually think I think hands also provide good augmentation, right? Because you're basically having like partial occlusions on everything. Yeah. Great question, though. Okay, so the results, I'll just kind of zoom through this. So basically, the original one did the worst on Toybox. Didn't actually do, it learned something. This is the fully supervised model. And I should say too, basically what we did was we trained it in the self-supervised way to get the features, and then we used those features to train a classifier on a holdout Toybox test set. And that's what these results are showing. So interestingly, the transform version, so where you're taking, like a slight rotation of the object, essentially, did the best and actually at a level comparable with fully supervised. And so that was a cool result. Questions about this? Other questions? Oh, yeah.
So when you take the transform image, you then do rotation cropping and all that kind of stuff?
No, we took, I think we left in like the color the color manipulation. So we left in some augmentations in all of them, but we took out the rotations, and I can't remember about the cropping. Yeah. So yeah, I would have to look. I'm not sure exactly, but that's a good question though. Yeah. I think ultimately it would be cooler to have a version of SimClear that didn't use any synthetic augmentations at all. Yeah. All right, I will zoom ahead because I am running out of time. So where do high-level reasoning? So I've talked a lot about, if you kind of look back at our architecture, I've talked a lot about essentially where stuff in like long-term memory might come from in this grand scheme of these high-level reasoning models. But these models also use search to work through problems. And so we were asking this question of, I can sit here and write the search algorithm for a Raven's problem-solving agent, but like, where might that actually come from how can an agent learn how to string together a bunch of low-level operations to achieve a high-level reasoning, to create its own high-level reasoning strategy? So for this, we're switching to a different test, not Ravens anymore. So this is a test called the Abstraction and Reasoning Corpus. Is a really cool test developed by this guy, Francois Chollet at Google. It has problems that essentially look like this. So there's basically, here, there's 3 different input-output pairs, just like visual grids. So the agent has to look at these example pairs, and then you get a new input, and you have to generate the grid for the output. So for this one, anybody want to describe kind of like what's going on? Like, how would you describe what the answer here should be? Or what's going on here? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
The red is going towards the blue.
Yep. Yeah. Red is going towards the blue, and then it like touches it and stops. Here's another one. Other ideas? Yeah, go ahead.
Boxes.
Yes, the little boxes go to the big box. Yep. Here's one. Might be a little hard for you to see. I'll just say. So this one is like a essentially like a palette mapping one. So you have different colors, and you get just enough in the input examples to know like what each color and the output should go to. Here's the last one. Yeah, up there.
Region filling.
Yep, yeah, region filling, yeah. And there's like some subtleties, right? It's like, does an open corner count as close? There's like some subtleties, but yes, essentially like region filling. So the ARC has several hundred of these tasks, individual tasks. I would actually call this a test of spatial reasoning, but okay, great, yes. Anyways, so my student, James, another great student who recently graduated, James A. Newson, decided to try to tackle the ARC essentially using program synthesis. So program synthesis is, again, another classic problem in AI. That's basically, if you have a programming language, how can you string operations together to write a program that does what you want? You can imagine this is a big deal in software engineering and has been for many decades. So James wrote a new domain-specific reasoning language that was sort of based on this idea of reasoning with visual imagery. So it had all these kinds of operations. Here's an example. This is like a list of the functions that are in his program. So you can see there's things like rotation and scaling and inverting. So this is like an expanded list, essentially, of like different ways to manipulate these grid-based images. And then his system would search and try to string these operations together into a program to try to solve one of these ARC tests. One of these ARC tasks. So this kind of worked. And the ARC basically has it has several hundred that you can look at, as part of your model development. But then it has 100 that are hidden, like a hidden test set, and you can submit your code and be tested. And they've been running these leaderboards on it. So in 2022, we were really excited. We tied for 4th place on this. If you're looking closely at this, you'll notice something funny about these results, which is that these percentage numbers here are not error, they are accuracy. And so basically, just by solving 2 of the tasks correctly on the hidden test set, we hit 4th on the leaderboard. It's a very difficult test. We actually submitted the same thing. They did another one in 2023, and we submitted our same, we didn't actually even change it at all. And we were actually so you can see a couple of teams have made more progress recently, but still really hard. And if you're curious and working on it, they actually also have this cool incentive structure where I think there's financial rewards, but basically if you can solve something that nobody else has solved before, you still get rewarded. So you don't have to feel like you're totally behind the 30% people. But anyways, one of the really cool things about this test was we would sometimes get surprising results. So this was one of the items that James actually did not think his system would be able to solve, but it did actually. It sort of strung together operations in a way that he didn't expect, and was able to solve it. Okay, I have actually one more thing I really wanted to talk about, but I might go 3 minutes over. Can I? Okay, I'll zoom ahead. If you have questions, because I have to show you guys the Anderson Cooper stuff. Okay, so this is the last thing I'll talk about. Again, another test. I love all of these great tests that come out of the cognitive assessment literature. They're really cool when you dig into them. So this one is called block design. You have these red and white blocks. You have to put them together to match this design that you see. And it's really interesting. So I had these 3 great undergrads, Avery, Alice, and Maya. Together we did a literature review looking at block design stuff over many decades. Basically, block design is interesting because you can actually watch somebody as they solve the problem. So their problem solving process is visible in a way that's not with like a pen and paper multiple choice test where you just get, like what's the final answer. So a lot of people over the years had looked at block design and been like, oh, if we look at the errors that people make or like the pattern that they put blocks down in, we can learn really interesting things about their problem solving strategy or their, cognitive processing. And so this was just basically like the number of papers that looked at different variables as being sort of interesting. One of this was, a lot of these papers are from like the 90s and earlier, even early 2000s and earlier. And almost all of them would say, this is really interesting, but it's just so time consuming. Like, you have to have somebody sitting there with pen and paper, like writing down every single movement that a person makes. Of course, now we have technology. So we were like, oh, why not just like record everything? And then we can, analyze all of this great data at our leisure. So we had, we had this sort of fancy setup where we had an overhead camera. That was a depth camera getting like the full state of the tabletop. And then we had a wearable eye tracker. So we could look at eye movements while people are solving the test. There's Anderson. So 60 Minutes came to do a piece about Vanderbilt's work, specifically looking at sort of autism and employment. And so this particular project was motivated by how can we use better visual and spatial assessments to improve essentially like job matching and sort of like recognizing those strengths in individuals for jobs that would value that. So Anderson Cooper volunteered to be our one of our test subjects. So we put the eye tracker on him and had him solve the test. We also had a really cool guy named Dan Berger, who's a data scientist. He was at Vanderbilt and then he left to go to Google, I think. He's on the autism spectrum. So he kind of volunteered to be our autistic volunteer test subject for this little demo that we did. Here's an example of what comes out of the eye tracker. So this is, I think, Anderson solving one of the items. And so you can basically see it's like, so the wearable eye tracker has a camera that captures the view in front of somebody. There's two inward facing eye cameras that record the eye. And then a bunch of, geometry calculations happen to project where somebody is looking onto the recorded scene. So the yellow dot is essentially like, where Anderson's gaze is pointed as he's solving this problem. So yeah, so that's kind of example of the data that we get out. And here's the results. And again, this is my last thing. So traditionally, when you give block design somebody, if you're not measuring all this fancy stuff, you basically have accuracy and reaction time. Anderson and Dan both ended up solving all the items correctly, so no differences in accuracy. This is showing response time. And you can see that Dan was faster than Anderson across the board, way more so on the harder problems. And this actually tracks with, there's been studies finding similar patterns in the autism literature in both kids and adults. Of basically autistic individuals are often faster on this test than neurotypical people are. But just looking at response times, like we can see that Dan is faster, but we don't necessarily know why. And so that's part of what we were trying to understand with our extra data. So here is the top-down. Here's what came out of the top-down view. So these are both sped up, but they're sped up the same amount. Yes. And before you laugh too hard at Anderson, I'll tell you, if I sat you down and gave this, it's harder than it looked. He was definitely working hard. He was sweating. So anybody want to say what they noticed, the differences? Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely like a big difference immediately visible in sort of the spatial pattern that they both used. Dan was using this row by row approach. Anderson, it wasn't like total chaos, right? Like it looked like he was kind of doing it based on like shapes, like modular parts. Here's some data from the eye tracker. And so basically just to briefly orient you to this, this is basically for one item, actually it's for the item I just showed you, where each person was looking prior to putting down each of the 16 blocks. So it's like look, put down a block, look, put down a block. And so, a couple of things you can see here, like you can see these are the problem blocks where Anderson was like really having a tough time on it. You can just see that Anderson is taking longer overall. One really puzzling thing we saw from here is that we noticed Dan was looking over, there's a lot of blue on Dan's, if you see. Blue was for the block bank. So that was basically just like the pile of blocks that's sitting off to the side. This actually surprised us because all the blocks are the same. So it's, and they knew that. So we gave him a chance to look at the blocks and like play with them before we told him all the blocks are the same. Why would Dan, it seems like if you're really trying to be efficient, you would just like, you don't even have to look over there, just reach over and grab the closest block. Yeah, you have a thought?
Just looking at the video, it looks like Dan is going for the ones that sort of are already oriented in the way that he wants them, whereas Anderson's bringing them over, adjusting.
Yeah, that is a great suggestion. And that's actually what we think was happening here. Although again, look, we haven't actually dug into the data to sort of know for sure, but it seems like what Dan might have been doing was essentially reducing his manual motor search for the block face and replacing it with what's actually a more efficient visual search on the pile of blocks. And I find this super interesting. And I think this is something that we don't have a great understanding of in AI, is like how, when an intelligent agent faces a problem, carves it into different search spaces. How does the agent actually pick which, this is a great example of where there's two different search spaces you could use. They both work, but like how and why can an agent figure out, to use one versus the other? Okay, there's like a few thoughts. I guess, yeah, we can merge into question time, I guess. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe the first pick that when he wants to pick the first one, he see the second one as the sources. Then, for example, for every pick, it has like 2 or 3 more steps. Then it becomes so together.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, so it's there might be more sort of like aggregated than just like one block for sure. Yeah, another thought? Yes, they are. Yes, they're all identical.
You want to place on the left.
Yeah, in our setup we did. We just kind of like, we shoved them all to the left and sort of like jumbled them up after the previous one.
Right.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Yeah. I guess that's actually funny. Were they both right-handed? I don't actually know. We didn't ask them. Yeah, that's true though. That would be interesting. Yeah. And that's a good question. Yes, a thought in the back.
Maybe more planning happening in blue, so you're planning your next move?
Potentially, yeah. I think from this, we don't like, it's still another step, right, to know like what the actual operations were that were happening in people's heads when they were doing, I don't know. It's a good question. Oh, that would, there's so many variations. We have not tried that. That would be cool though. Yes.
Because you're showing 2 data like Dan
Mhm.
I'm wondering if the row by row, like the arrangement is the same across, like all this.
Great question. So we, we did this whole demo and it's supposed to turn into bigger studies. However, that was actually February 2020, which was yes. So then we switched gears and we actually ended up making an online system, which I think in the end is better because we're just going to be able to do like a lot bigger studies and not have to mess with all the data annotation and processing, which is kind of messy when you're using real cameras. So this is our online system. And it basically, we wanted to see if we could do this without actually needing an eye tracker, even like a webcam based one. So you can see we have this way where when you mouse over different regions, it only shows you one at a time that's visible. So that's our proxy for measuring like people's attention. And we're just in the middle of collecting data with the system. And we had some pilot data, but there was this long story. We had like bad instructions and a bunch of people didn't understand. So we lost like half our data, but but this is basically, so this is actually, this is adults just in an online study, adults on the autism spectrum or who are not on the autism spectrum. And, this is just like a sample of that data. But I think your question is a really important one. And one of the things that we're just getting ready to do a bigger study with like several hundred participants. And one of the things we really want to see is what is like the spread of strategy differences across both groups. And are there clusters and, are they correlated? We're doing a bunch of other measures. Are they correlated with other measures and things like that? Yeah, question.
Just based on the search patterns, it's so interesting to see if you had a new condition where you are actually got a dynamic pattern
changes every once in a while.
Ooh,
Because with the first dance, performance,
Mhm.
obviously was sort of imprinting on that,
Huh.
first image and not going back to it.
yeah.
And Anderson was going back and forth all the time. And these also seem to speak to that. I'm sure you're getting to that, but if you introduce some dynamics in the pattern, you might throw off what otherwise would be not.
That is really cool. Yeah, we've been looking at a lot of different measures, like you said. One of them is sort of like, so if you look at the design over time, basically, do some people look at the design mostly early and then they just kind of remember and then they don't have to look at it again later on, or do they really, or do some people sort of look back and forth? And that's true. That would be really interesting. And then you could see, do people adapt their strategies once they realize it's dynamic? Yeah, but in the back there.
From a statistical point of view, it seems to me, for the design of experiment, people's background can easily affect this. Think about Dan and Anderson, forget about the autism. You'll have somebody who has these problems are probably common for them, and you have another person who's common crowd, and their strategies are vastly different. It might not be due to the autism, but a confounding factor there.
I think that's totally true, yes. And I think, one of the things that we sort of emphasize throughout my research is we're not just looking at things that are sort of, a lot of autism research from the cognitive perspective, and this is also valuable, of course, has looked at things that are diagnostically valuable. So things that you see in autism, but you don't see in neurotypical. I think we're more interested just broadly in looking at neurodiversity in general. And so are there patterns that maybe some of the people with autism do and some of the neurotypical people do? And what does that cluster look like? And I think you're absolutely right. So in the study, we're also asking people their educational and work, their current sort of work sector. Like I mentioned that people who, there's been a lot of research showing that people who have high spatial skills, often measured by tests like this, will have a much higher probability of going into STEM careers. And so that's something that, yeah, but you're totally right. And we're also asking questions about childhood activities, which is also a predictor of spatial skills. And then you get into gender questions because it's activities that, little boys are encouraged or have, traditionally been encouraged to do more, tend to be spatial, like Legos and stuff. Of course, nowadays we're trying to sort of equalize a lot of that in society. But yeah, no, it's a great question. Yes.
So the first you showed it understand in the real eye tracking. But then you showed it the visual thing. So then you show that the one puzzle or one box at the time, and then it will change. So I guess that's advantage of the Anderson cutoff. But this is, the second design, the visual design, is the disadvantage domain for the dance. So then probably the people with the spectrum has a less effective performance.
It's a great question, yeah. And I think there's other differences too. So another way that the online version is actually harder is in the real version, you can see multiple sides of a block at a time. Whereas in our thing, it's you're really straight on. But we actually thought, so the thing is actually implemented in Unity. We had a developer build this for us. And so we've thought about, we could actually take the tabletop and just tip it a few degrees for the view. So we may do that in a future study. But no, there's a lot of differences that are interesting. All right, I think let me just zoom through to my last slide and then we can, I guess, maybe have another question. So education I didn't talk about, but we have this cool game that we're building that is about sort of visual scaffolding for helping teens on the spectrum learn, improve their theory of mind reasoning skills. And then I just have my final acknowledgement slide because I wanted to acknowledge our funding and of course, lots of great students and postdocs over the years that I did not get to talk about their work in detail, and lots of other projects that I didn't get to talk about, but please ask me later. And yeah, I guess we can, I don't know, it's time or a couple more questions or however you go. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we're especially thankful to Maithilee because she came from Scotland where she's currently doing a sabbatical, and she decided to get up this morning to get a coffee, and she went down to get a coffee in the hotel. Everything was closed because it was 2 a.m. She hadn't changed her clock.
Yes.
So she's doing well on that amount of sleep. I think we'll stop here, but thank you for your talks. So, we'll start again at 1:30. You might want to be here just a few minutes before that and file in here. But I'll see you then. Thank you.